Hey guys, it's Standing for Truth coming to you tonight. We are live with Raw, Matt, Jeremy, and Landon. We are going to have a lot of fun tonight on behalf of some of our best evolutionist friends, Nesslig and Ration, alMind. We're going to start off with Nesslig and his blog. Make sure you watch our first two videos addressing not only his blog, but also some of the information that Ration, alMind has put out. Also, actually, as I'm getting things ready here, I'm going to toss it over to just Raw Matt for a minute because we've been working on, I think it's chapter 6 of Ration, alMind's blog, attempting to debunk replacing Darwin. So we've got some good information there. We'll touch on that at the end, but the main focus is going to be some of the claims and objections that Nesslig has brought up in his latest in his latest blog entry, as well as a few things that we left hanging last time. For example, some stuff on ENCODE, junk DNA, the onion argument, genetic entropy, and beneficial mutations. He really, it boils down to whether or not a few rare beneficial mutations can counterbalance or compensate for the information loss based on genetic degeneration. So we're really going to touch that and hammer that, because if we can dismantle his claims on beneficial mutations, his entire not only his argument falls apart, but also his evolutionary worldview. So I'll give it over to you, Matt, if you want to kind of just touch base and give the audience a rundown of the work you've been doing this week, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, absolutely. Sure. I guess we'll begin kind of with something called epigenetics. For the people that are listening, it sounds maybe a little bit confusing at first. So we'll get into it, because this is where the root of what beneficial mutations are. So when you hear about people saying there's such thing as beneficial mutations and we need them and that's how we evolved, and they bring up the lactose mutation and the increase in bone density and the HIV-1 immunity and then the L. Milano, these are all epigenetic regulations. These are not mutations. And so now that we've been unraveling the sequences of epigenetics for the last 6 years really, really well, they've actually completely eradicated the beneficial mutation theory. So basically what I want to do is get into the problems that people are having with the concept, and that would be, kind of explaining epigenetics. So basically, epigenetic inheritance is this new unconventional way of looking at genetics. Up until now, mutations were considered the only thing that could be either positive or negative in regards to fitness, because without mutations, evolution can't occur. So this is where epigenetic comes from, and it goes against basically the idea that inheritance only happens through genetic mutations, or the DNA code passes on to the parent from offspring. This means that a parent's experiences in the form of epigenetic tags can be passed down to future generations. So circadian rhythm, diet, stress, environment, all of these switches, for example, like rats, they took rats and they put them in an aquarium and they switched the lights on for 3 hours and off for 3 hours. And they kept doing this for years. And eventually those rats adapted to this light cycle. So when they had offspring, those children now would fall asleep every 3 hours and every 3 hours, just like the parents were doing, even if the lights were not being turned on or off for every 3 hours. Sometimes it was inherited, other times it was not. And then after a couple generations of lights being back to 24 hours, the rats just essentially gave up on that and they went back to being a 24-hour cycle. So it wasn't a permanent thing. It wasn't a mutation that caused this. So epigenetics is the study of where factors influence a gene and how and when the gene is expressed. Regarding like the Sherpas of the high altitude people of the Nepal, the mainstream thought is that a single 1-point mutation led to a better adaptation for the high altitudes of the Tibetan people. But modern science has revealed that the epigenetic mechanisms are also behind this adaptation. It's not a beneficial mutation. You can read a peer-reviewed paper on this, on the epigenetic signatures of the high altitude adaptation of the Tibetan population. So basically, these epigenetic regulators affect how individuals develop. This is pretty much which are causes of changes in the expression of the genes or action of a gene, or any gene, for example. We have longevity genes in us, for example. They're called the FOXO genes, and they're 7 sirtuin genes, and these are mediated by epigenetics. They're not mutations. They're turned on and off. Like for fasting, for example, turns off a mTOR, and it activates these longevity genes. We want that to happen, and until we can go in and mutate these genes and constantly leave them on, we have to rely on epigenetics to do that, and we are in control of these genes by what we do. So that was an example of that. Let me try to think where I'll go next.
So technically, when Nesslig, I'm pulling up his blog here just to have some of the exact same things that he said. I'll pull it up in a screen share. So when he says, for example, I mean, everything we said about genetic entry, all the detail we go into, he pretty much just disregards it and resorts right to beneficial mutations and how, Dr. John Sanford misrepresents Kimura's figure, even though what we said last time was that Dr. John Sanford has looked at this in so much more detail because Kimura is so much more oversimplified. So it comes down to the mutational effects, and he pretty much resorts to beneficial mutations. He says beneficial mutations can, what does it say here? Well, in essence, counterbalance the harmful mutations. While we say, obviously, due to the influx of deleterious mutations, a rare 1 or 2 beneficial mutations are not going to counterbalance or compensate for the information lost. So technically, everything you're saying, especially if it's a epigenetic related adaptation, that's no help to these evolutionists, right? Because that's not going to explain the net loss versus the net gain. Is that right, Matt?
Exactly. If you think about it like twins, twins have identical DNA. And think about it like one person turns 50 years old and so does the other one, right? But one will have cancer or heart disease, the other might not. One will go bald or be bipolar or start to lose their eyesight where the other doesn't. This is because of epigenetics. It's not inherited genetic mutations like we're told. Take, for example, the epigenome, which keeps a long life communication between environment and our genes that turn on and off tumor suppressing proteins. This is a reason why one twin will get cancer and the other will not, because epigenetic changes via the individual diet or environment it'll cause this. So when you hear about beneficial genetic mutations, you are actually hearing about epigenetic regulation, not beneficial mutations. This is why the Sherpa people who have been called beneficial mutations that allow them to thrive at this high altitude, yet when they relocate and have children, they pass on none of these beneficial mutations, so-called, for these high altitudes because they have no genetic requirement for living at such altitudes. So again, it was never a beneficial mutation. It was already present in the gene that got switched on. Evidence is now shown that it's nurture over nature. So to make matters worse for evolutionary theory, epigenetic modifications themselves are actually often resulted in DNA errors. And this leads to gradual but inevitable DNA degradation as well. So epigenetic adaptation will never result in any kind of evolution because epigenetic mechanisms only regulate pre-existing biological information. Since epigenetics is not mutation-based, and there is no actual proof for beneficial mutations anymore of all these things that we're talking about, like the lactose mutation. They claim that it was a single SNP, a single point mutation resulting in lactose persistence, but that's wrong. It's epigenetics like all the rest. It's actually a methylation level, MCM6 and LCT genes. So the more they look into the epigenetics, the more that they find that it's that relation and it's not a mutation at all. So
exactly. So Nesslig here, if you're looking at anyone who can see the screen, no one's looked at this in more detail. Well, for one, all population geneticists do agree that man is presently degenerating. They might resort to rescue devices such as synergistic epistasis, mutation count mechanism, relaxed selection, but all this has been falsified. So in essence, Nesslig's really his only argument is to resort to Kimura, who stated that he did believe that beneficial mutations were enough to counter the harmful effects of the deleterious mutations, but he gave no reason for that. And Dr. John Sanford has given, and it's just plain and evident not even from Dr. John Sanford himself, that the no selection zone, sure, a couple beneficial mutations will be, these high impact beneficial mutations could be amplified, and then the worst detrimental, mutations will be selected against. But it's those near neutral, those low impact mutations that anybody should be able to see are, for one, the majority of mutations, and will contribute to the erosion of meaningful information, especially for the fact that they're largely unselectable and invisible. So his primary argument here then, and any even beneficial mutation he could use, really does fall flat on its face then, based on even what you're saying here in regards to epigenetic adaptation, right, Matt?
Yeah, I agree. Oh, a matter of fact, I should say that I think I saw somebody in the chat, you wanted to bring something up. What was it? Landon, you mentioned something about epigenetics, but you just said it in chat. Did you want to say something on it?
I was going to say that it's similar to Lamarckism, which is like a competing evolutionary theory, which kind of arose around the same time as Darwinism. I just think that epigenetics more confirms Lamarckism, and it kind of refutes part of Darwinism's claims. That was just what I was going to say.
Got it.
So
got it. Yeah. No. So it. We're gonna get up, since that's his. His main argument. Even though he didn't address anything about the real-time evidence for genomic degradation. I mean, I'm going to present some papers later on mammoth populations that were shown to have high genetic load. Homo neanderthals 40% less fit than modern humans. High genetic load. Homo naledi. The hobbits. Cheetah populations, genomic degradation on all levels, entropic degeneration, even on epigenetic levels, right? I mean, we got the pandemic of autoimmune diseases, immunological diseases, cancers. Really, it's on all level. I mean, in bacteria, reductive evolution. So we'll get more into that a little bit later. He didn't address any of that here in this rebuttal. It certainly lacks substance, but he did talk about junk DNA as well a little bit. So we're going to get Jeremy in 1 second. I just wanted to go over this because no rebuttal to this either. This is rock solid. Evolution, the universal common descent, that really is falsified, because when you're trying to compensate for loss of information, normally single point mutations that are acting in the genome don't add up to the type of information that is being degraded. A single point mutation can kill a gene, but it's extremely hard to improve a gene unless you can change strings of nucleotides. So this is where we get into the rock solid paper on the waiting time problem, because, and I've got a visual up here for the audience as well, just to see. Random letters in the alphabet don't have information, but if you start to put them together, you can build information. We need words to enhance or compensate a genome. So right here in the slide, I've got the link to the paper. Read it, rock solid. 10,000 scientists have read it over. No serious critique, no serious rebuttal. The waiting time problem in a model hominin population. Right here in the results section, it says biologically realistic numerical simulations revealed that a population of this type required inordinately long waiting times to establish even the shortest nucleotide strings. To establish a string of 2 nucleotides required on average 84 million years. To establish a string of 5 nucleotides required on average 2 billion years. We found that waiting times were reduced by higher mutation rates, stronger fitness benefits, and larger population sizes. However, even using the most generous, and we're even doing that here with Nesslig, we're saying, listen, have a few beneficial mutations where there is a net gain in fitness or a net gain in information, but it's still not going to counterbalance the influx of deleterious mutations, the influx of accumulated damage. But even with the most generous feasible parameter settings, the waiting time required to establish any specific nucleotide string within this type of population was consistently prohibitive. So in conclusion, read the paper, rock solid, really technical, really long. It really falsifies evolution at this point. We show that the waiting time problem is a significant constraint on the macroevolution of the classic hominin population. Routine establishment of specific beneficial strings of 2 or more nucleotides becomes very problematic. So at the end of the day, huge problem for the evolutionists, falsified on its own. That means anything else, say phylogenetic systematics, for example, based on a false assumption that universal common ancestry is true. So I just wanted to cover that. The paper links here. We'll also provide it in the description of the video. Jeremy, are you there, brother?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, so in the blog, you know, we read it over a little bit later. Something jumped out at us in regards to his claims on junk DNA, ENCODE, the onion problem. Did you want to touch base on that for us, Jeremy?
Yeah. Once again, we see bias. Once again, we see biased atheist evolutionists fighting ENCODE. Let's not forget that when ENCODE revealed its preliminary 80% function in DNA during 2012, most scientists accept it, especially theistic or Christian evolutionists who are more honest with the data. It's the atheists who are liars. The media too was excited about it, as we know. And I was there too. And don't forget, these results were predicted by creationists all along since the 1970s by Dr. Henry Morris. Guys, is my audio doing well?
There was a little bit of an echo a few seconds ago. I think it's gone away though.
So it's okay, more or less.
Yeah, I think it's fine right now.
Yes. Okay. Thank you. These results of the ENCODE was predicted by creationists since the 70s by Dr. Henry Morris and other creationists. Okay, there are many papers about this prediction, and it's also predicted by the other camp, the intelligent design movement, and a lot more. Okay, it's even predicted by old Earth creationists. My goodness. See, convergence, huh? Okay, so the 80% thing, as we know, is ENCODE's phase 2. Okay, ENCODE's phase 1 was a little more specific on their test. They tested only 1% of the genome, yet found function on most of it. They were wrong because they expect most of that 1% to be junk. Okay, yet most are functional as predicted by creationists. So this led to the ENCODE phase 2, which tested the entire genome and revealed preliminary data that most of our genome has function. They found out that most of the function is regulatory, and this wasn't predicted by evolution at all. If it's so obvious, why wasn't it predicted? Okay, if they listened to creationists, they would not have been stunned of these results. In short, the genes on the regulation part. In short, the junk DNA is telling the genes when to produce their product, the proteins, and when not to. Does that sound functional or not? Sure does. An engineer would easily see that. From a design perspective, by the way, from a design perspective, it's a huge waste of energy to replicate the DNA that's unnecessary. That's unnecessary. Sorry, not good at English. From a design perspective, it's a huge waste of energy to replicate DNA that isn't necessary or functional, right? If it's junk, then it's a huge waste of energy for the DNA to be replicated. The very presence of junk DNA, in a way, in modern organisms and animals, is also, in a way, like I said, inconsistent with evolutionary theory, if you want to look at it in a different angle. Okay, and this this suggests that the DNA is replicating non-junk after all. Okay, it suggests DNA is replicating non-junk DNA after all. Or else, why? Yeah. Anyway. And the ENCODE wasn't alone, by the way. Other independent tests on DNA function on the 80% area also revealed unexpected functions. Okay. Other organizations also tested the junk areas, the areas where the 80% are. These were only bits of the 80%, but still function was found, which again was not predicted by evolution at all. Because they were so sure in 2001 that 98% of the DNA is junk. And right now, again, not learning from their mistake, their blunder, their evolutionary bias, right now they're so sure again that ENCODE's data is misleading. Wait in 10 to 15 years or less. They will be shocked again, and they will develop new rescuing devices. They are always stunned to be wrong. How many times do we have to prove evolution wrong? These are the predictions made by creationists. So like I said, since bits of functions are also found in the 80% area by research outside of ENCODE, the ENCODE results are reliable because the general evidence from the ENCODE project are supported by outside research independent from ENCODE. Okay, and this is a strong case if you put this in court. Almost every basic unit of DNA, the nucleotides, are linked with some kind of function, whether it's high level or low level function. And we even know where they are in the genome, their precise locations, and what binds them, and their connections, and so on. And most diseases are also found in the junk area, and they even affect gene activity, which suggests again more function. Also, ARE, or ancient repetitive elements, which are sequences of DNA found many times throughout the human genome, were defined as junk before. But now, something called the start again. The ALU. This is a variation of the ARE. This is the ALU elements. It's a specific type of repetitive element. Okay. Once again, these ALU elements in those AREs has diverse roles for gene regulation too. Functions are everywhere.
But if you don't mind, I just wanted to touch base on that since you're in that area. Even the endogenous retroviruses is very interesting too, because one of the first class of sequences to be expressed, Jeremy, after the first and two-celled embryo are these ERVs, or endogenous retroviruses. And it was actually determined that if you knock these sequences out, you block their expression, you actually stop embryogenesis at the 4-cell stage. So what holds the placenta together is actually a class of proteins, and the proteins that are coded or specified by retroviral-like sequences. Different in the mouse than in the human. So there's switches called promoters, and a recent analysis too, and the number of genetic switches in our genome contributed by these endogenous retroviruses. I think it's 181,000 roughly. You look at the literature, and what they're doing now is looking at the expression of sequences, how they are copied into RNA, and what they found was that most of the expression is taking place in this so-called non-coding DNA. So when they investigate these classes of sequences, as numerous as they are finding a whole series of functions. So even ERVs thought to be junk are now playing these very important roles.
Yes, ERVs are one of the many examples we have, all not predicted by evolution. So we are really uncovering function everywhere. Once again, sorry,
No, go ahead, brother.
I thought you were saying something.
Nope,
Once
nope.
again, so we are really uncovering function everywhere. Once again, if these biochemical activity in the junk areas of the genome are so obvious from an evolutionary perspective, why wasn't it predicted? Why so many excuses after it contradicts evolution? Okay, and I remember never mind, because when ENCODE came out, most scientists accept, but most scientists who have nothing to lose on the creation evolution thing, they embraced it. But atheist evolutionists who have a lot to lose, they're the ones who attack ENCODE. One of the articles, they even said ENCODE should have used evolutionary assumptions, because it's impossible for the genome to be dysfunctional in evolutionary history. Millions of years of mutations should have produced a junk genome. So bias, as you can see. Well, anyway, let me go back to the point. Okay, what else did ENCODE study? Yeah, ENCODE also studied cell types. Actually, they only studied a few, as far as I recall. They studied about 100. I know it's not 200. They studied about 140 to 150 cell types. And since our body has thousands of cell types, a lot more function was predicted to come and surprise us. So as you can see, the ENCODE results are really very preliminary. A lot more function is to come. We really don't understand most of the DNA language. Because of these, evolutionists were forced to implement another rescuing device. Okay, because of these evidence of function, they are forced to come up with another rescuing device, which suggests that after a gene loses its original function, if it is possible that its remaining sequences can be co-opted. I'm not sure if co-opted is the correct English. May be co-opted for a different function. So if that function becomes important to its host species over time, it will be maintained through natural selection. Here, as you can see, they are again what do you call that? Using natural selection as their rescuing device, and they cannot even make predictions on this natural selection as it relates to this junk DNA thing. Okay, they cannot even measure the uniformitarian standards which applies to this natural selection. They cannot make retrodictions on this rescuing device, on nearly all the rescuing device they made. Okay, and they actually used several cherry pick examples for these to show that this rescuing device could be the correct rescuing device. But what they are not telling you is this: their examples are not enough at all. That's why I call it cherry picking. They need to show the vast majority of the genome is like that, because they predict a mostly junk genome. So the turning on and off of function by natural selection should be everywhere in the junk areas, but it's highly lacking. Okay, so as you can see, why develop rescuing devices if ENCODE didn't threaten evolution? All right, I mean, this is almost a slam dunk. If you present this in court, you'll be exposed for your bias with this. Let's be honest here. These atheist evolutionists are assuming evolution and using it as a starting point. They want to maintain junk DNA because evolutionary history should have produced should have produced the DNA version of a fossil graveyard. Okay, so evolution should have, just like the fossil graveyard that we observe in the geologic record, DNA should also be like that based on their assumption. We should also find fossil graveyard in DNA. Okay, right now that high functions are found, they feel their worldview is threatened. That's the truth. Don't lie. Your triggered response after ENCODE showed that you're guilty. A guilty person would have so much excuses, just like atheist evolutionists. And one more thing, which is very, very related to the junk DNA argument. This is also this one also severely weakens the junk DNA argument. Okay, by the way, the initial prediction of evolutionists was that junk DNA should be conserved by about more than 90% among species given the long ages of evolutionary history. The animal kingdom inheriting junk DNA among one another throughout evolutionary history. So the DNA should be highly conserved. We should have DNA similarities with this species, that species, that species. Overall, about 90% should be. That's their prediction. Okay, so above 90% was expected given junk DNA is so close at 98%. Okay, so as you can see, 90 and 98%. Okay, the prediction on the conserved DNA is 90% above, and the prediction on the overall junk of DNA, I forgot if they did the specific number, but we found out in 2001 prematurely that it's 98% junk, but right now it's no longer 98%. Okay, but that's how now what we find. Okay. Okay, so above 98%, above 90% was expected given junk DNA is so close to 90%, like I said, on the conserved region, okay, on the conserved regions. But that's not what we find. What we find are that only 50% are conserved. My goodness, this is a massive failure in prediction. That actually, when you do the numbers, strips away hundreds of millions of years from their timeline. So what happens if you strip away millions, hundreds of millions of years from their timeline? Evolution is dead, severely compromised. For example, let me explain. Genomes of whales, mouse, let's say cat, dog, chimps, humans, and there are more, have DNA letters that are unique. Okay, 50% conserved, but 50%. It's true that when they research this, 50% are conserved, but the other 50% are not conserved and are unique set of genes. This again was predicted by creation. Okay, this is a slam dunk. All right, this is a severe contradiction to evolutionary theory. That's why they invented, say again, rescuing devices. Well, basically it's like this. The DNA letters of a species I just mentioned, those dogs, cats, and the others, may have an A in one area of their genome. Sorry, how do I explain this? Okay, basically it's like this. The DNA of a species I just mentioned may have A's in one area of their genome when compared side by side to another species, or letter C's on one side compared side by side on another species. And you can even compare them all together. And there's a pattern of uniqueness. Like I said, 50%. And that 50% unique sections don't show the same A's or C's on one area when you compare those species I just mentioned. This is not what you would expect from junk DNA. Okay? Evolutionists can make a case from the 50% conserved areas, but what about the other 50%? Okay? This evidence clearly shows discontinuity among the species, because the Bible said they were created separately. Okay, so what else? Oh yeah, the onion thing, right? Standing for truth.
Well,
I almost forgot what he said about that.
Well, what's funny too, and before we get into that, because I've got that part up on the screen in his blog where he talks about the onion and how it has more DNA. But I just find it funny to begin with, before we even get into that scientists have discovered many functions for the non-protein coding DNA, as you were talking about, such as regulating alternative splicing, say in brain cells, and then also playing an essential role in placental development, as I was expounding earlier. But why should we, or the scientists that are discovering these functions, have to justify their work by referring to, as Nesslig would like us to, onions, which have neither brains nor placentas? So I find that to be rather funny. What's your observation on his argument on the onion test and genome test?
Yes, I recall the onion thing. I read the blog too. The argument is basically like this. The argument is that the vast majority of junk DNA must not be functional, because if onions, as we know, which are not as complex as humans, have a lot more junk DNA than humans. They say that it isn't necessary because of the variations in DNA density among the species of the onion family. Okay? If onion species with small amounts of DNA can grow and can grow or survive as well compared to those with large amounts of DNA, then some of the DNA must not be important or necessary, correct? So as you can see, they have a case here. But I would say this is an argument from what's the English? It's an argument
From ignorance?
from ignorance. There are only limited to no studies that support the idea that the large amounts of junk DNA in some onion species are not necessary or important. There is we just almost have no data about that, yet they infer because of their evolutionary starting point. So there have been no studies, or only limited studies, to support the idea that the large amounts of junk DNA in the onion species are not needed. So they must be able to knock out the majority of the onion genome and see what happens. The problem here is that the onion argument is based on evolutionary assumptions, not real evidence. And you cannot even present this in court. That's it, and they know it. So to those atheist evolutionists who think junk DNA is junk, you should take the you should take the junk out of your genome and let's see what happens. I dare you.
Well, and larger genomes may not be highly compressed, much like
Yes.
ours. With us, we're dealing with a very highly compressed genetic code here, so that could be a correlation as well.
Yes, correct. Since we mentioned knockout, their favorite argument is the mouse. So I think they will use the mouse gene knockout argument, and creationists have a rebuttal to that also. But we'll get into that next time. And back to the onions, it's possible that the junk DNA is only needed under some conditions. I mean environmental conditions or situations, because onions don't have the same don't have the same option as organisms that can move, correct? It may be necessary for extra variations through speciation potential that God put in the genome as the environmental conditions change and onions would adapt. So in a way, we predicted this also. And finally, I think, am I taking too much time already?
No, Keep going, keep going. I think it's best we address the majority of his blog here. So no, keep going.
And because I have things to do also. And finally, on the onion, we don't judge the size of its genome. Okay, we don't judge the size of its genome. We do not judge a book by its cover. Atheist evolutionists should know better. We judge it by its information contained in the genome. Okay. The human genome, for example, is smaller than the chimp genome, but our genome contains more information than chimps. You see, we can easily flip this around. Okay. There is the nucleotide compression argument too, like standing for truth just mentioned. Okay, and the way I see it, really so dumb how they so lack of knowledge, and they don't know how to interpret evidence. Most evolutionists didn't go to law school. That's why they don't know how to investigate evidence critically. They don't even know the difference between an assumption and fact. Or if they know, they chose to interpret guesses as fact because of their evolutionary bias. So I think that will be all. I'll be a little busy, so you guys talk ahead. Sorry.
Well, right here too. Let me see here. So this part was about linkage groups and how they can only get worse with time. And he doesn't spend too much time on it, but Nesslig essentially resorts to recombination of these degenerate linked genes. So I'll cover that here a little bit too. And I've got some, because my argument was that mutations in linkage groups are linked basically forever. And so if you have lots of bad mutations in that linkage group, and that linkage group is reducing in fitness continuously based on accumulating deleterious mutations, I even gave Nesslig 1 or 2 beneficials that are truly, a net gain in fitness. And even if you gave them those, you throw those in, they're just going to get neutralized by the large numbers of deleterious mutations. So the linkage is actually a killer and a destroyer for evolution, because that means, like I said before, linkage groups can only get worse and not better. We're looking at Muller's ratchet here, and I'm going to read this off, and his argument about recombination really just falls flat on its face. Right here with Muller's ratchet, there is a given ratio of good versus bad mutations that enter a genome, with bad mutations always being predominant. So this is essentially what I just said. But therefore, the separation of rare good mutations from abundant bad mutations is essential to halting genetic degeneration. Where there is sexual recombination, this may be feasible. However, in whole genomes or in genomic regions where there is no sexual recombination, the good and bad mutations are inseparably linked and cannot be teased apart. In such genomes or in such chromosomal regions, the predominant bad mutations cannot be separated from the rare good mutations. So that results in a downward ratchet mechanism that guarantees net genetic degeneration. So if he goes to recombination as, say, a rescue device here, trying to find where I have the slide. There's 2 problems with that, Nesslig, is when the human genome is examined, it is consistently discovered that the genome exists in large blocks, like I've explained, 20,000 to 40,000 nucleotides, where there's little to no recombination that occurs. This means that virtually no meaningful shuffling is occurring on the level of the local nucleotide string. So that's the major problem that he doesn't seem to understand. Only large gene-sized blocks of DNA are being shuffled. Very rarely, if at all, does shuffling occur at the nucleotide level. So really, he can look to that as an explanation to solve the degeneration problem and to explain away the fact that linkage groups only get worse, not better. But it's not science. It's not demonstrated. It's pseudoscience. So even if there was shuffling at the level of the nucleotide, there's a big probability issue. And essentially his entire, as Matt and I talked about at the beginning, he really just resorts to beneficial mutations. Kimura gives no justification for what he said in regards to why he didn't introduce beneficial mutations. So I think it's funny because it seems like Nesslig seems to believe and assert that as long as beneficials happen, regardless of how rare they are, everyone admits that that they're rare, and they can even when you get a beneficial mutation, they can seldom make the type of compensation that's needed to stop the net loss of information. But it's funny because he thinks as long as you get a couple beneficial mutations, pawns come to people evolution must be true. And even if, say, adaptations happen, apparently that proves this type of evolution. But he's obviously not understanding that, you know, a genome or say a population can be undergoing genetic degeneration. And I think it all comes down to this in a nutshell, destroys all his arguments, because species can be undergoing genetic decline due to, say, the massive numbers of slightly deleterious low impact mutations, while selection, no one disagrees with selection, may be amplifying a handful of beneficial mutations. So these species can still be undergoing minor adaptive changes, fine tuning, say, to its environment, but it's still degenerating in many other ways. Picture a 12-year-old car. It's still degenerating in all possible ways. You can change the brakes, change out the tires, install new windshield wipers. Has the car stopped degenerating? We can all agree there's probably been an advantage, there's been an improvement, but not the type of improvement that's obviously going to solve this degeneration problem. Even a human being, I mean, the more you age, the older you get, the more your cells mutate. You can get a facelift. You can get all these surgeries. Sure, there's been an improvement temporarily, but there's no way to actually stop the systematic degeneration. So there's no way to solve the problem. Natural selection would be severely constrained by, say, selection interference. I got a visual here for the audience. All that means is selecting for one trait would then interfere with selecting for another trait. And when you have billions of traits segregating in the population, then the selection process starts to work against itself. What that means is you end up with being able to only select the best and worst mutations. And it's just a fact that we inherit a multitude of mutations from our parents and grandparents. And from the first division of our zygote, we begin to add new mutations to that genetic load. There's an increased genetic load. This is, for one, it's obvious, and it really comes down to it being fact. We accumulate mutations at the rate of 3 new mutations every cell division throughout our entire lifetime. So this genetic load causes aging and limits the upper life limit of the human species. So at the end of the day, It's not really contested that human mutation rate is 100 mutations per person per generation. That means our children have about 100 mutations more than we have, and our grandchildren will have 100 more mutations than they have. So that's disturbing, not only on a personal level, like I was talking about earlier, but also on a population level. So Nesslig's going to have to do a little better than he has done. Because I think it's pretty evident that he's failed. He can appeal to beneficial mutations all he wants. Couple beneficial mutations not going to compensate for the information loss. He's going to have to explain how selection can somehow prevent the accumulation of large numbers of minor mutations, or else the species is going to quickly degenerate, deteriorate, and fitness is going to decline. But even if he can find a way for selection to keep minor mutations in check, it's going to be too weak, too powerless to stop the accumulation of the largest, most abundant class, the nearly neutral mutations. So higher genomes will eventually degenerate with or without selection. Matt, if you're listening, do you think, based on his appeal to, what we know to be rare beneficial mutations, does that really solve the degeneration problem, brother?
Well, I think that back when Kimura was studying it, I'm not exactly sure why he negated some beneficial mutations in his study, because he was really early on, maybe even kind of pioneer in the area. But there was a lot of assumption, I guess, for things back then, and I think he made a pretty good choice in it. So, and
you're good with these too, right? Beneficial, even the best beneficial mutations you can show us, they're mostly reductive. Look at sickle cell anemia. It's had a significant impact. It has been, environmentally beneficial, but it's a broken gene, broken protein. In the long run, it's not going to take things forward. It's not going to answer the question or the problem of net gain versus net loss. And that's what Nesslig hasn't answered here either. You can't take 2 steps forward and 10 steps backward and expect to make your way up the mountain. You know what I mean? Like, these beneficial mutations are mostly reductive. Just like you talked about in the beginning of the broadcast, Matt, you named a few beneficials. They were either a loss of specificity, loss of information. They really, even just like you said, you give them a couple, still not going to counterbalance the damage, right?
Well, the thing would be, if I could understand if the beneficials were some really, really good beneficial adaptation that's going on that would cause something to eventually change. But when we're looking at the deleterious mutation, the harmful mutations, not only do they greatly outnumber, but they're very harmful. And we can say, for example, okay, so what? There's 10 harmful mutations. All something has to do is live to reproduction age before it can pass on that beneficial gene, and then boom, we've got beneficial mutations galore happening. But that's not exactly what we're seeing, because the beneficial mutations are so minute in their benefit. And then when we are looking at these beneficial mutations, now we're finding out that they're epigenetically regulated and not a true mutation. That just changes things even more now, I think.
Well, I think it's funny too, because he goes into gene duplications as well. And if you're following the evidence for, genetic degeneration, if you have a gene that's, say, been accumulating negative mutations for a lengthy period of time, it's obvious that this gene is now in a partially degenerated state. So if Nesslig wants to, say, duplicate that gene, well, guess what? The deleterious mutations are then duplicated with it. So duplications obviously are not going to slow down the degeneration problem. If you actually consider it carefully and logically, it's probably going to speed up the degeneration problem, because if you're duplicating this already degenerated gene, and the fact that gene duplications are almost universally deleterious, that's not going to be a way to offset the many accumulating deleterious mutations. So once again, that would be a fail to answer the problem of net gain versus net loss. So I think it's pretty logical that, you know, his claimed duplicate genes are going to clearly contribute to accelerated degeneration and accelerated mutation accumulation. So even something like scrambling through gene conversion, for example, that's going to speed up the degeneration process as well in regards to the gene duplication. So I don't see how, you know, he could possibly answer this this problem. And you know what? Let's get to this portion because he didn't answer any of them in his blog, and we presented a lot. Matt, let's go through some actual examples of genomic degradation in real time.
Oh wow! As far as like as far as the numbers go, like the decrease in the human population rate, I
mean, I'll start it off. Mammoth populations. You know, we were looking at that paper. I'll pull it up on the screen here in a second. Actually, they were highly inbred and carried an elevated genetic load.
Oh yeah, for sure. I like the mammoths. Don't get me wrong. The mammoths are pretty cool. They're good because they have multiple studies from multiple continents that all showed genetic degradation in 3 different studies. The problem that I have with the mammoths is that when you do isolate a species, they do have some weakness in genetics. So that's just, you know, they're cool, but I like the other studies that are mass amounts of species, mass amounts worldwide, where there's no isolation that's causing genetic integrity to like fail and really go down. So that's
which ones would you go to, brother?
Oh, I like the worms.
Yeah,
worms,
that's a good one.
It's a really good, but their mutation rate is like 100-fold of what they thought it was supposed to be. That's a really good one. We have frogs. That's a really good one. There's the Tasmanian tiger is an example of the one like penguins, where it was more like isolated. There weren't very many left. So as they're dying, they were like starting to interbreed more, and it was we don't really have many of them to test. So unfortunately, they haven't really been doing too much testing on this. So we're looking at it from a different perspective, because we're looking through the research, looking for genetic degradation, and species are dying out and going extinct extremely fast. So they're not really looking into the genetic load. They're looking more at the diseases that are causing them to die, and they're chalking it up and just saying, oh well, it's our fault. You know, it's global warming, human population overgrowth, and everything's dying because of that reason. And so they're not really bothering too much with looking at genetic degradation. So that's why I mean, there's still studies out there, so it's great. We have a few. But
well, what I like even about the, like, for example, the mammoth populations, Neanderthals, like a lot of these inbreeding related reductive evolution, obviously consistent with genetic degeneration. You know, a lot of evolutionists will scoff that based on the inbreeding, you know, it's mostly expected, but based on genetic entropy, it's a lack of their understanding, because inbreeding, it's like a sneak preview of where we're actually going genetically as a species, because inbreeding exposes the genetic mistakes within the genome, and reveals the hidden reservoir of genetic damage that's actually been accumulating. So if you want an idea of where we're heading in regards to genetic entropy, you can take a look at a population like those mammoths. You can take a look at the Neanderthals that were 40% less fit than modern humans. You can look at the hobbits that had a high genetic load, reductive evolution. You can look at Homo naledi. You can look at these cheetah populations. It's very, very much consistent. And then even bacteria. It's not really contested that reductive evolution is a commonplace in bacteria. Yeah, so really you see it in everything: animals, bacteria, humans. entropic degeneration on all levels. So I found it funny that we went into detail on that the last couple times, and he didn't really even touch any of it in his blog. His only argument would be looking to beneficial mutations, but obviously beneficials, as we've demonstrated here, they're not going to keep up with deleterious mutations, and near neutrals should be virtually unstoppable. So that alone falsifies evolution. The waiting time problem falsifies evolution, and his denial of the trajectory of say, our genome in regards to function really exhibits a strong bias. Actually, now would be a good time, since we've covered everything in detail in his blog. You've been working on Ration alMind's blog, chapter 6.
Yeah.
You obviously people can just go read that. Do you have a few things to say about that? Like, how did you feel about the strength of his arguments in his rebuttal to, it was chapter 6, right, of Dr. Jensen's book, Replacing Darwin?
Right. Yeah. It was interesting because he was basically attacking everything on a biased assumption and saying that he's being extremely biased, but he himself was being biased in it as well. So that was odd. Found that pretty strange. Kind of a weird argument, you know. He was mad at first. His contention was obviously against creationism. That's why he started the blog out pretty aggressively. And he said Jensen didn't use the trio studies. Well, trio studies were primarily conducted to only identify de novo disease mutations. It just happens that they were used for chronology on primate evolution. It's basically that assuming the changes of the genome are all neutral, and then expected sequence of divergence, you know, and that expected number of substitutions between a pair of species, it estimates mutations rising. It calculated into it that to a common ancestor of a divergence time. So the trio studies used evolution assumption. And then, matter of fact, it directly states that it assumed it happened and added it to calculations. I'll read it. It says, interpreting the fossil record was reflected as 30 million years between the split between human and apes, or old world monkeys, and using average nucleotide divergence of 6.2% between the two species suggests that the average mutation rate should be 10-9 per base pair. So it's obvious that why Jensen didn't want to use methods with assumptions based directly on them. He wanted to use calculations free of assumptions. And since 2010, trio-based studies all use single nucleotide genome or germline substitutions, were the main source of all data to learn about mutation rates. And then we know for a fact why he ignored using those, because he didn't want to use ape to man divergence times, because he doesn't believe in such a thing.
Yeah.
Right. So you know, he basically those assumption based trio studies are where we even got that number 100,000 to 200,000 year old chimp divergence, or mitochondrial Eve. That's where those numbers come from. So that was one of the things that I noticed, is that he was mad at Jensen for judging and dating mtDNA, but not and mad for the trio studies. But I would have actually agreed with him using trio studies if they just looked at grandfather, father, son. But they didn't. They extrapolated data and then added it to a preconceived notion of a split hundreds of thousands of years ago. See what I mean?
So you would say that a lot, actually, you made a good point that a lot of what you read, that Ration alMind was writing in his chapter 6 rebuttal, it almost seemed like it was more of, it seemed like it slowed down near the end, but it almost seemed like he just had more of a distaste or a disliking to the book in general.
Yeah. He would mention things about Jensen. I mean, believe me, it's nowhere near Aaron Raw and Kent Hovind going at each other.
No, I don't think anything is.
No, they know each other's personal life, so that's next level. These actually are really going after the research. They're trying to disprove each other using science, so that's cool. I like that. That's a debate, you know. But he really doesn't like creationism, and you can tell when you're reading through it. Like that's what he wants to break down. He doesn't attack the person. He's attacking creationism. So it's okay. You know, I guess that's expected nowadays. I mean,
and in regards to like the later portions of Ration alMind's Chapter 6 Rebuttal, did you want to leave it up for, say, anyone interested to just read it over, or did you have anything that you felt compelled to kind of go over here?
I guess I could just talk briefly on like some of those statistics on mutations. You know, a scientific article on America came out that says it's called Mutation Control. And basically it states that according to the standard population genetics theory, the figure of 3 harmful mutations per generation implies that 3 people would have to die prematurely in each generation or fail to reproduce for each person who produced in order to eliminate the now absent deleterious mutations, which is a 75% death rate. Humans do not reproduce fast enough to support such a death toll. As James Crow said from the University of Wisconsin, he asked, why aren't we extinct then? That's a pretty fascinating one. See, they have rooted in their mind of an old timeline, and observational science shows, you know, it's fast mutations. So they have to explain that, and it really can't. So they came up with a theory that perhaps it was slower in the fast, and it's building, and it's higher mutational rates now. But for example, when they tested primates recently, apes, they found that their mutational rate speed is 30% faster than us. So that's an incredible find. Let's see. They stated that in human, the mutation rate would have been relatively recent, or have been a small magnitude in recent history to make evolution true, according to the trio clocks. You know, that's a good one. So unfortunately for them, the mutation rates have been increasing. There are 561,119 genetic defects in the human genome at a population level. The number of disease-causing germline mutations is also over 300,000 now. 1 in 5 healthy adults carry a disease-related genetic mutation. This human genetic mutation database, which basically maintains all the database of genetic mutations in human DNA at a population level, over 3 months, they average over 6,000 new genetic mutations that are harmful. Not a single one that's been beneficial has ever been cataloged. That's an annual growth of 24,000 defects, horrible genes. That's genetic degradation, and that's a biological fact. They find it everywhere. So the number of random beneficial mutations is 0, but with 24,000 every year seems pretty imbalanced right now.
Yeah, no, that's when I was reading through, you know, a lot of the rebuttal that you responded to on Ration alMind's response to Dr. Denson. I mean, so much of it was just, it seemed like you had a lot of fun doing it. So hopefully a lot of people who are interested, anyone in the audience, they can read it over as well. And then if they have any questions, you know, we can certainly go in more detail. And actually, I've got the screen popped up here. I just wanted to hammer this one down one more time, because even reading through Nesslig's last response in his blog, I mean, I was able to just rock out rebuttals right away because they didn't seem strong. And Muller's ratchet, I mean, I made a slide here just to help with the audience watching it. This first point I could possibly be corrected on, and I would stand by, I would accept correction. But from what I've seen, large blocks of DNA in the genome have essentially no historical evidence of recombination from what I've seen. And so I'd imagine that even if it does happen, it's very rare. And recombination appears to be primarily between genes rather than between nucleotides. So that means that within any local gene sequence, there is mostly no recombination. And these blocks of DNA, which essentially are immune to recombination, are then subject to Muller's ratchet. So that's the whole point of these linkage groups, only getting worse and not better. They're degenerate. They're a fatal blow to evolution. And if the good mutations and the bad mutations cannot be separated, and the bad mutations are overwhelmingly deleterious and significantly outnumber the good mutations, it's obvious and it's certain that any such stretch of DNA will degenerate. let's say we wait for these 1 or 2 rare beneficial mutations that really are a net gain in novel information, a net gain in fitness that Nesslig talks about. It's obvious to anybody that bad mutations are now building up throughout this region. So even if we could succeed in accumulating perhaps a large number of, good quote unquote mutations within a region, and we're waiting for the next one to come along, we would start to see many of our good mutations start to back mutate into the bad. So the bottom line is, and Nesslig did not address it at all, is that Muller's ratchet will kill an emerging gene long before it can become functional. So I thought that was pretty weak of him in his argument against linked genes and the degeneration problem. So I want to bring Landon into it just to end it here. He got an article that he wanted to read. So Landon, brother, I'm going to hand it over to you. Take as much time as you need. Go ahead, man.
Okay, this was an article I wrote. It was in response to evolutionist on your one of your videos, the comment section. He was saying like, well, what I've observed changes in viruses or something. He's like, well, that's evolution, isn't it? And it was an old straw man argument that I've encountered before. So I wrote that partially inspired me to write this. I called it, "Dear Evolutionists, you just don't understand creationism." Okay, so I'll start. If you are a creationist, how many times have you heard the phrase, "You just don't understand evolution"? I've heard it quite a few times over the years, to the point that I wish I had $1 every time this phrase was said. Evolutionists will say this quite often in an attempt to devalue creationist positions by critiquing our knowledge on the topic. But how much truth is there to it? Sure, there are definitely creationists who misrepresent evolutionary claims. For the most part, however, we as creationists dedicate much of our lives to defending Scripture, which includes the lengthy and sometimes years-long study of our opposition, which in this scenario is evolution, namely neo-Darwinism, and the belief that life arose through purely naturalistic processes. I can confidently say that I understand changes in allele frequencies over time, as do most of my creationist friends. We have to if we are to debate the topic properly and effectively. Despite us repeatedly proving that we do in fact understand evolution via online discussions and debates, some will still erroneously insist that we don't know what we're talking about. The subtle irony in this is that evolutionists themselves commonly misinterpret and misrepresent creationist arguments and beliefs, which in my opinion shows that they don't research their opponents to the same extent that we creationists do. Indeed, the evolutionist misconceptions are nothing new to me. Over 3 years ago, I wrote a piece titled "Common Strawman Arguments Evolution Proponents Shouldn't Use." I said, yes, I even avoided using the word evolutionist, which they tend to criticize as unprofessional, not an actual word, etc. It dealt with topics such as creationists not actually advocating for fixity of species, what it would actually take to falsify evolution, the frequent unfair criticisms that those with contrary beliefs face, and a few other topics. If I remember correctly, I pointed that article out to several atheist evolutionist members throughout the years when they misunderstood what we actually believe. Even so, I still encountered the same misconceptions, which, as I mentioned above, seemed to signify that they weren't taking the debate in opposition nearly as seriously as the creationists are. The two main ones I want to discuss here have to do with variability, mutations, and speciation. For instance, a common evolutionist argument is that since we observe mutations in the flu, that a new vaccine has to be developed every year or so is proof of evolution. Creationists don't deny such biological changes. In fact, these changes are included in our overarching models. The other example is that since we observe speciation is proof of macroevolution. I partially agree with this. In a sense, creationists do accept macroevolution to some extent if we are defining it as the evolutionists are. However, this does nothing to help support the evolutionary position of universal common ancestry or the idea that all organisms are descended from a single cell-like ancestor. We embrace the biblical concept of kinds, and most kinds constitute more than a single species. Therefore, the speciation we observe is no problem for us. I think that if evolutionists want to actually debate us on some of our actual beliefs, they need to study our beliefs and our writings in depth, just as we study theirs. Until they do this, we will likely continue to win some discussions by default, as they aren't accurately representing our beliefs. Of course, I still expect to see these misconceptions peddled far into the future, though it shouldn't bother us creationists to a significant extent. We've done our research and we presented our beliefs in arguments. It is then up to the evolutionists to formulate valid counter-arguments based on the correct understanding and interpretation of our own claims. If they do this, then great. But if they don't, we should continue to argue to the best of our ability, defending God's word, and the scientific truth. And that was the end of it.
Awesome, man. That was really good, actually. Agreed with every point you made there. And you're right. I think when an atheist goes up against an informed creationist, someone who's done their due diligence, they will continue to lose because it seems like they've got a total straw man idea of young Earth creationism. And an important aspect of a debate is to be able to articulate your opponent's position correctly and accurately. Because if you're just fighting a straw man the whole time, you're not really accomplishing anything. And any informed viewer is going to understand that that person obviously doesn't understand their opponent's position, and they lose by default. Just like with genetic entropy, the rebuttals I've read, they're sad because all they do is acknowledge the obvious things: beneficials, adaptation, natural selection. But genetic entropy begins after acknowledging those things. So if you're not going to articulate your opponent's position accurately and you're going to fight a straw man, there's no gain in that. So that was a very good article, brother.
Thanks. I just, like, in relation to what I was talking about, like, I've even seen some evolutionists, they don't even think we accept natural selection. Like, they think we just completely deny it just altogether. I don't think they really know. Some of them, they don't really know what they're talking about in regards to what we believe. And I just don't think they really care. So they just think, well, I don't have to bother researching because I already know that they're wrong. I think that's kind of.
No, and it's like I was debating Raging Atheist the other day, and what a hoot that was. What a good time that one. But the guy had no idea what he kept asking for evidence, and I kept pointing to, the three major haplogroups: genetic degeneration, whatever, first and second law of thermodynamics, evidence from design, fine tuning, and he couldn't understand any of it, and he had no response other than show me your God, as if he wants me to just put God in a jar and present it to him and say, here's God for you. You know what I mean? Just nothing but weak. For one, he couldn't articulate my position. He couldn't even articulate his own position of universal common ancestry. I think he barely even understood what the word biological evolution meant, a change in allele frequency in populations over time. So that's why a lot of times when I'm having discussions, I'll say things like natural selection, no one's arguing with that. Beneficials, they do happen. Is there a net gain in net fitness in these beneficials? So you're spot on, man.
Yeah, it's just a recurring problem that we have. And I've had to explain creationist beliefs so many times. This has been going on for years. So, it's just, I guess it's something we're just going to have to continue to deal with, because I just think a lot of it is that they just don't really take us seriously, and then they kind of get surprised when we have done research, but then they don't think we're right anyway, so they just don't want to learn about our position, really.
You know what? Yeah, that's another brilliant point. For example, I debated, it was Jackson Wheat and then Godless Galaxy. And he wanted to do another one, and I was all for it because he said he admitted, I better study genetic entropy. So we must, I think it was a little over a month before our second debate. So that's a month to prepare. That's a month to write, genetic entropy refuted and go read some evolutionist arguments or something. And he brought nothing to the table. So just like you said, it's like they don't take it seriously, and then they get into the debate and they get demolished and they make excuses. So I found that rather telling, that you've got a month to prepare for a formal debate. Don't you think you'd go look up some possible rebuttals to the same arguments?
I just think they're so convinced that we're wrong that they just don't want to bother really researching the topic. They are so convinced that they are right, and that's the end of the story, that they're just not going to learn about what we believe. You know, they're not going to research all the things we've talked about. You know, I just think that's the main problem.
Well,
oh, is that you, Jeremy?
yeah, sorry.
No, go ahead, brother. It's been a while since you. How's everything going? You got something to say?
Forgot what I'm gonna say. But I don't think everybody what Landon said. Sorry.
I'm hearing an echo or something.
It's not mine.
Just go ahead, brother. Talk.
Yeah, I forgot what I'm gonna say. Well, yeah. What were you saying again, Landon?
I was just saying.
That everybody, that the atheists are so convinced they're right.
I think that has a lot to do with it, and they're convinced that we're wrong. Like they just do not. They're just so convinced that we're wrong that they don't want to research creationism in depth.
And they love to share to say about the majority, correct? In the scientific community, believe in evolution. That is why they believe in evolution too, correct?
Yeah, I mean, I think they rely on consensus way too much.
That consensus is a myth. Let me explain. In schools, is creation science taught? No, right?
No.
Only evolution. Only evolution in schools, correct? So, and where do scientists get their education from? Schools, correct? Having never heard of creation, having never been taught of creation, naturally, obviously, most scientists will be evolutionists. It is as simple as that. Sorry for discouraging your faiths, atheist apes, atheist thinking apes. It's as simple as that. You don't know how to investigate evidence, but I do. In a court of law, you dig into the foundations, the deepest regions, the deepest levels of something. And this is the most obvious fact. No creation science in schools. Okay? And if you're gonna use the Dover trials on me, think again. You know what the court said in the end? Intelligent design may be true, but because it's connected to religion, we cannot allow it in schools because it is connected to religion. But they did say, like I said, intelligent design could be true. See that? It's politics in a way. So don't use the majority, 97% of scientists believe in evolution on us, unless creation science is also taught alongside evolution. Okay? That's as simple as that. Okay? And by the way, atheist stinking apes, one more thing. You like the majority? Okay. Let me give you the majority. Most of the people in the world believe in God. Why not follow that? You see? Did you go to law school? Do you know how to interpret evidence? Majority of the world believe in God. Your atheists are only 2% of the world. It's the agnostics that are so many, about 10%. Atheists are only 2%, and it's falling because of the collapse of communist countries and so on. Why don't you follow the majority that believe in God? Okay, be a theistic or Christian evolutionist. Okay, it's okay. Majority believe in God. Right? Dumbass. And one more thing. This is something you cannot deny. Science starts with naturalism, correct? You rule out supernaturalism even before any investigation in science. And by nature, your foundation for science is bias. And you try to force fit everything into naturalism only. And there's this saying, I forgot the exact word. There are evidences there are overwhelming evidences, for example, that may support a particular hypothesis, but in many cases turn out to be false. after all. This is the nature of evidence. Okay? So you force fit everything. Of course, it will look like it will fit. It looks like it fits. But there are many cases which seems to fit the evidences but turn out to be wrong. This is something you have to learn in law school. Do not be so convinced. It's so easy to debunk you, to tell you the truth. I'm a former atheist evolutionist, and I hate you atheists. You have murdered 250 million people last century alone. Your atheist governments murdered 250 million people last century alone. And I cannot let that go. You might say those atheist leaders did not we're not doing it in the name of atheism. Oh yeah, communism was a direct result of atheism. Okay, so if they didn't do it in the name of atheism, their actions did it in the name of atheism. Thank you for showing your bias, atheists. Sorry, standing for truth. I just
No. Actually, I wanted to ask you, because a lot of the times when you bring up Stalin, Mao Zedong, Hitler, the second you mention Hitler, they'll say, oh, he was a Christian too. You ever heard that ridiculous argument before? What do you say to that, Jeremy? I think it's a funny one.
Not a single historian agreed that Hitler was Christian. Not a single one. Everybody knew Hitler was only pretending to be a Christian because he is a politician. And since most of Nazi Germany were Protestants, Hitler had to. He's a politician. Politicians do lie, not all, of course, but Hitler is known to be a liar. That's why not a single historian agrees he's Christian. Actually, most historians agree Hitler was, in fact, irreligious. Irreligious, and atheism is part of being irreligious. So it hurts, right? Atheist apes that Hitler is like you. You are like Hitler too. And one more thing. This is one of the most obvious things I have noticed in this Hitler argument. Atheists use public quotes from Hitler. Public quotes.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, they use what Hitler said about Christianity, the good things he said about Christianity, but in a court of law. But atheists never or rarely mention Hitler's private quotes. And there are tons of Hitler's private quotes. Not only that, the closest friends of Hitler, his inner circle, all agree Hitler was anti-Christian. Hitler even tried to Hitler even tried to kill the Pope, and the Pope even tried to kill Hitler during 1944. You don't know these atheist apes?
I've even had them give me pictures of Hitler walking out of a Catholic church or shaking hands with a priest or something,
yes.
as if that's supposed to be absolute proof right there. Oh, you got me,
Yeah, it's a public thing. That's a public play.
It's all an act. It's what politicians do.
And atheists even say that German soldiers have a word God on their belts. Well, I have a Hugo Boss belt. Does that mean I support Hugo Boss, the belt brand? Not necessarily, correct? I mean, public quotes versus private quotes. Okay, public versus private. It all goes down to that. Those atheists use Hitler's private quotes, which all historians agree he was just pretending. While Christians and theists use Hitler's private quotes. Which is more reliable? Public or private quotes? Easy to tell, correct? You're dead. Your argument is dead, atheist. Hitler could be a pagan or an atheist, either one of those. But paganism is being associated to atheism too. So You are the direct results of Hitler.
What I find interesting is that they always say that Christians are to blame for wars, and so are all religions are. But this is where the Encyclopedia of Wars comes in, because Charles Phillips and Alex Rod, both are atheists, by the way. They found that 66 wars were attributed to Islam. No surprise there. 57 made up the total amount of all other religions combined. That means out of 1,763 total wars, 1,640 were not religiously motivated. Big numbers.
Yes.
Yeah.
And Romat, if we were to count religious atrocities in the span of 2 millennia or 20 centuries, the maximum would be 50 million. Okay, 50 million in 20 centuries, and that includes everything, including the defensive posture of Christians during the Crusades. They were only trying to defend themselves, correct? So there will be collateral damages. All right, and look at what atheism did in the 20th century alone. 250 million in 1 century alone.
Well, look at the philosophy behind abortion. I mean, how many babies are murdered today? 3,000. And what's the philosophy behind that? That
Standing for Truth atheists will tell you that those who commit abortions are mostly Christians. But here's the thing. There's a difference between real Christians and Christians by name. And those who did those abortions are only Christians by name.
Yeah, I mean, people don't take into account that, I mean, you can say you're a Christian but not be regenerated and filled with the Holy Spirit. I mean, there's a false convert and a genuine born-again Christian. Those are two different things entirely.
Yes.
Right. Yeah. If I met a Christian who was pro-abortion, and I have, that certainly leads me to question, the reliability of their testament, because how can anybody believe that, a baby made in the image of God can be aborted like that? I mean, it's nothing but murder. And I think it all comes back to the philosophy that, we're nothing but the result of, unguided evolutionary processes, sharing a common ancestor with an ape. I mean, that's gonna lead to psychological problems, and well, we've seen it in how many atrocities, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, I put at the end of almost all my videos, I don't have a problem with atheists in general. I have a problem with what things make people become atheists, because they lead the world in depression and suicide, medication intake, and I mean, and school shootings. Like 99% of them are school shooters. That's incredibly high, because they feel they have no meaning. The Columbine, they wore shirts that said Darwin and natural selection, and they did it on Hitler's birthday, by the way. I mean, there's no meaning to life. There's no purpose. So they feel upset and depressed and down. So even if religion is 100% wrong, the fact is people need to have something to believe in. And the schools rob divinity out of people by telling them they're nothing but chance, that just by luck you're here, and by luck you'll die and nothing will happen. That is a disease for the mind, for the human mind. It's cancer.
Right, you put it perfect. That's exactly what it is. Disease for the mind when you believe those types of things. It's a philosophy, and the ripple effect of it, the outcome of it is exactly what you just said. And I've got so much anecdotal evidence and anecdotal stories of atheists that I know, and just like you said, medication consumption, especially antidepressants.
Yeah, think about how many people convert to Christianity to get over those things. They convert, they become a Christian, they give up alcohol, they give up addictions, they give up gambling. If they're a murderer in prison, they repent. They want to change their ways. How many people become an atheist? What happens then? They do the exact opposite. They want to explore all those things. They feel repressed in life that they couldn't do those things. It's very ironic, isn't it?
That's a
Right.
good point.
Yes, going back to the atheism thing, here's also the thing. Atheism or modern atheism started to rise during the 1856, during Darwin's time. Okay, and what are the odds that the rise of atheism also led to the rise of genocide in the 20th century? Is that an accident? And why are all those major genocide committed only in atheist states? Why? What are the odds? And the Holocaust. I recall, the name is Martin Brooks. He wrote in a New Scientist magazine or something in 1999. He said that a direct line, as in direct line, runs from Charles Darwin through the father of the eugenics movement, Darwin's cousin, Francis Galton, to the extermination camps of Nazi Europe. You see? A lot of links between the Holocaust and Charles Darwin. And there are many things in Darwin's book that that suggest he's a racist.
Well, they try to deny that he was a racist. I mean,
Yeah.
he probably was. I mean, you can look at the quotes. I mean, and infer.
Yeah.
I mean,
There are quotes indeed, and they're not quote mine. They're so obvious, those quotes, comparing humans to baboons and so on, and degrading the status of women, that men, he said, are more evolved than women. Darwin said that, and so on. Atheists don't like to see the truth. Or maybe they know the truth, they just don't care. Because I was also like that before, when I was still an atheist. And nobody doubts that Hitler is a devout evolutionist. Nobody doubts. Just read his book, The Mein Kampf. There are a lot of evolutionary ideas there. And he applied it during the Second World War. And even before he died, he talked a lot about evolution. My goodness. His secretaries recorded it. Martin Bormann, one of his staff, recorded it. He was ranting and raving about evolution even before he died, before he committed suicide. See? If Hitler wasn't an evolutionist, these murders would not have happened. And take a look. Do you guys know about the 1C conference during 1941? The 1C conference was a conference which initiated the final solution to the Jewish question. It comprises of several leading Nazi leaders, not the top level, but somewhere near the top. Not Hitler and his gang, but somewhere close to them. There was a quote in that 1C conference. You can even watch the movie. It's called The Conspiracy on HBO. And the transcripts are also there. One of the leaders of that 1C conference said that what we do to the Jews, Darwin would be proud. So killing the Jews, Darwin would be proud. He actually said that, something like that. That not the exact words.
Wow. Even
Yeah.
even brings me to mind Margaret Sanger, if I'm saying her name correctly. Wasn't she big into eugenics?
yeah.
Which kind of, yeah, and she Planned Parenthood and the entire philosophy behind that. I mean, it's all correlated from what I have studied, right?
Yes.
Yeah, I think so.
And, you know, Stephen Jay Gould, one of the top evolutionists last century, even said, you know, I really memorize these things because they really stick to me. That's why I hate atheists so much. These quotes I even memorize. He said, Biological arguments for racism may have been common before the 1850s, but they increase by the orders of magnitude following the acceptance of evolutionary theory. Racism was the cause of the Holocaust, one of the causes, and so on, a lot.
The only debate that I've ever heard that made sense to me was when they say, look, if atheists were so bad, then how come Christians are the majority in prison? They don't even understand what they're talking about, which is good because that means they've never been to prison themselves. But I'm just saying that if they actually knew the statistics, they would be realizing that when you get locked up, there's a sheet that's handed in front of you, and you basically choose what you are. Atheist is actually next to other or none, or it's actually considered a religion by the Supreme Court. So they can choose it because they get now benefits in prison, because they were upset because Christians could leave their cell every Saturday or Sunday to go to church. They could go to the library and get religious books. They get different diets. If you're Muslim, you get kosher meals and no meat, no pork or anything like that. Like you get a lot of benefits by choosing a religion. So the atheists were upset about that because they were saying that they were nuns, and so they now have a checklist that says other or none, things like that. So that's fascinating.
That is interesting.
But there's a great article that atheists can read. It's called "Fellow Atheists, Quit Bragging About Our Prison Under Representation." And I can even link it. It shows the actual numbers of people that are actually atheists that are in prison, and why the people claim to be Christian. Like my cousin, he goes to prison constantly. He's always in trouble. So what he does is when he goes, he signs up to be a Christian because he extorts them. Christians are giving people, right? So he pretends he doesn't have store or anything like that, and they comp him and they give him things, soups. He'll never repay him back because he's a dirtbag. But essentially, he's learning the system, and he realizes, hey, if I claim religion, I can get all kinds of perks and benefits and basically a free gang. In case I don't know anybody, Christians are pretty big in numbers, so you at least go in and you can be intermingled with a group of people, so you actually have numbers on your side before you can join a gang or you're forced to. So that's where that comes in.
Yes, that's correct, because there are a lot more Christians by name out there, so naturally there would be a lot more Christians by name in prisons. See, it's as simple as that. If we have a lot of atheist population, then the atheists would also be a lot in prison, even more.
Yeah,
Come on. These atheists, their arguments really cannot pass in court.
Yeah, it's a pretty common sense correlation there.
Yeah, so obvious. My goodness, do they think we are dumb for not knowing these? That they're trying to go around these arguments.
I think
they are so so much pride in them. So much pride. They think they're correct all the time.
I think with this portion that we're talking about too, this would be a really good idea to do a full hangout on. Maybe we'll set that up this week. I wanted to end it here just to kind of bring it all the way back to what we were talking about at the beginning. I know Matt wanted to just touch base real quick just to end it here on why beneficial mutations should not even be added to evolutionary calculation. So I think that's a good way to end it if you want to end it there, Matt, and then that'll kind of end it with a bang and sufficiently, I think, address all of Nesslig's points there. Go ahead, brother.
Yeah, sure. I said I don't think the beneficial mutation should be out of the calculation, not because now that we've just figured out that they're actually not beneficial mutations, but epigenetic regulations. But I don't think that they should be added because, especially since when you add a meaningless number, like let's say to the math equation like 1, the number doesn't tell you anything specific. They are basically saying that 1 represents a beneficial mutation akin to 1, a harmful mutation. So basically something like cancer, but nothing is as beneficial or even remotely as close. So if anything was as beneficial as cancer mutations are harmful, then beneficial mutations like anti-cancer genes would be all over the place, since cancer is all over the place and disease is all over the place, but yet we don't see a single one. And cancer has been around for a long time. Same thing with arthritis and osteoporosis. And since they've added to the calculations, we find that beneficial mutations should be everywhere, but that's not the case. So why add them?
Right, that's a good point. Like we've documented thousands and thousands of Mendelian deleterious mutations, and where are all the beneficial mutations in man? You know what I mean? They should be popping up virtually everywhere, and yet they can point to 1 or 2, and we can point to 1,000 detrimental mutations. So yeah, that's actually a really good point. How many visible birth defects do we see that are mutation related? Where's the visible beneficial mutations, birth mutations? I mean, it's just so, it really just negates the fact that beneficial mutations shouldn't even be considered in, they're too rare. They shouldn't even be considered in the calculations. You're absolutely right. Okay, so what we'll do is we'll end it here. I think this was a success. We'll figure something out for this week for our next broadcast. But good job, guys. I want to thank you for coming on. Matt, Landon, Jeremy, and we will talk to you soon, probably later this week, guys. Have a great night.
Thanks. You too.
Bye.
Bye, guys.